Hello, my name is Christopher Renstrom. I'm the creator of rulingplanets.com and Christopher Renstrom Astrology. And this time, I wanted to talk to you about the astrology of Wicked. Wicked, as you probably already know, is based on the 1939 film The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz, as we all know, is an amazing classic. It's America's first real fairy tale, and it was written by a fellow named Frank L. Baum. The movie starred Judy Garland as Dorothy Gale, and also Margaret Hamilton as the Wicked Witch of the West. Everyone loved The Wizard of Oz. I mean, what was not to love? Who wouldn't want to have their house picked up by a cyclone and carried miles and miles away to a fantasy land beyond one's imagining? And that was indeed the story of Dorothy in the original Wizard of Oz. And the Wizard of Oz is, of course, told from Dorothy's point of view as she travels down the Yellow Brick Road and meets her friends the Scarecrow, the Tin Woodsman, and the Cowardly Lion as they all go to the Emerald City to ask the wizard to grant their wishes. For Dorothy, it's a return home. For the Scarecrow, it's brains. For the Tin Woodsman, it's a heart. And the Cowardly Lion, it's courage. Well, the wizard doesn't grant their wishes right away, but actually charges them with an assignment to bring the broom of the Wicked Witch of the West. Basically, the Wizard of Oz is sending Dorothy, a young girl, and her friends to go and kill the witch and to bring back her broom as proof and evidence that this is exactly what they have done. This always left audiences with a sort of sense of unease. Why is a young girl being asked to go out and do a man's job, which is to kill someone? Now, this is something that fired up the imagination of Gregory Maguire when he wrote his book, Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West in 1995. Here is the story of the Wizard of Oz, but told from the point of view of the Wicked Witch of the West. Now, like in the 1939 film Wizard of Oz, Elphaba, which is her name in Wicked, that is the Wicked Witch of the West's name in Wicked, Elphaba is green, just like Margaret Hamilton was green. Another thing that informs Gregory Maguire's version of Oz in Wicked is the 1978 film, The Wiz. The Wiz was a wonderful film. I loved that film when it came out. It starred Diana Ross and Michael Jackson, and it was basically an African-American version of The Wizard of Oz. But what made it so fantastic was that it was set in New York City in the 1970s. So this wasn't a glistening Oz. This wasn't a wonderful fairyland of Oz. This was New York given a sort of surrealistic twist in the 1970s. And it was absolutely eye-opening, and it was marvelous. I absolutely fell in love with it. In this version, the Wicked Witch of the West's name is Eveline, and she runs a sweatshop on the west side of Manhattan, which of course invokes the Wicked Witch of the West terminology. But here we were introduced to a dystopian Oz, an Oz that had fallen on hard times. And there was definitely a political bent to the film that was directed by Sidney Lumet. This vision of a corrupt Oz also made its way into the novel written by Gregory Maguire. Now, Maguire doesn't set Wicked in 1970s New York City, which had happened on hard times. In fact, during the 70s, New York was bankrupt. But what he takes from that is an atmosphere of corruption, where people aren't to be trusted. And the person who's definitely and clearly not to be trusted is the wizard himself. So no longer do we have the happy, bumbling charlatan, the man hiding behind the curtain from the 1939 Wizard of Oz. In Wicked, we have a wizard who's much more malevolent, and his motivations are darker. Now, the other element that we're going to want to keep in mind as we talk about Wicked is the idea of Carl Jung's the shadow. The shadow was a concept that was put together by the psychologist Carl Jung to explain the darker side of our natures, the side of our natures that we're not really all that comfortable with. And because we're not comfortable with those aspects of ourselves, we have a tendency to project them onto other people. Now, the shadow, according to Marie-Louise von Franz, is the personification of certain aspects of the unconscious, which could be added to the ego complex, but which for various reasons are not. And that's a direct quote. What she's talking about here is that the shadow is the dark, unlived, repressed part of ourselves. It's often associated with our anxieties, our fears, and our biases. Things we don't like about ourselves, things we don't like to talk about ourselves, and that we, as I said before, often tend to project onto other people. In astrology, the malefics are often associated with the shadow. The malefics often stand for the attributes of a horoscope that we aren't really proud of, that we don't really like, that seem to be associated to ill will and misfortune. The shadow is most famously connected to Saturn, but let's not forget the other malefic, Mars, which has to deal with one's desires and with one's anger. But it's more often than not associated with Saturn, which has to do with fears, anxieties. And we can also even extend the realm of the shadow to the planet Pluto. Although Pluto is not technically a malefic, it is named after the Roman god of the underworld and has very strong associations with things that are deep and dark inside of ourselves, aspects of ourselves that we might regard as being wicked or malevolent. Now, a shadow can often show up in interpersonal relationships. Like, for instance, we might not like the fact that we can be very covetous, and that might be an aspect of ourselves that we don't like, so we're going to project it onto someone else. We're going to say, so-and-so is covetous, so-and-so is jealous of my successes, and I just can't stand that about this person. Whereas in reality, we may actually be the ones who are covetous or are jealous of other people's successes. So shadow can show up in interpersonal relationships, but it can also show up in the collective as well. Like, for instance, when a society decides that a group of people are murderers or rapists or bad or evil, when they go and sort of put a stamp on a huge section of society or whole group of people. This is what's called the collective shadow. It's something that you might not at first buy into individually, but over time, because of the culture that you live in, it begins to infiltrate your psyche. It begins to take an impact on people, and it can manifest as a collective fear, a collective anxiety, or a collective bias. The convenience of being able to project a shadow onto an entire other society or culture of people is because as long as we say that those are the bad ones, those are the evil ones, those are the murderers and the rapists and the people who want to corrupt our society, we don't have to look at that in ourselves. And this is something that Carl Jung really introduced as a dynamic in psychology, and it's something that often shows up in our horoscopes as well. And as I mentioned before, the planets that often will represent the shadow will be the malefics, which are Mars and Saturn, and also Pluto, which is not really a malefic, but you kind of group it at the same cafeteria table. The benefics in astrology are Venus and Jupiter. And the reason why they were called the benefics in astrology is because they were the purest lights in the nighttime sky. Mars was a sort of ruddy or even a muddy red, and Saturn was very pale and far away and very slow moving. And so that's why Mars and Saturn regarded as the malefics. They weren't pure lights in and of themselves. And Venus and Jupiter, well, these were the benefics because they were the purest lights. No light was brighter and whiter than Venus and Jupiter in the nighttime sky. And so Venus, we know, is named after the Roman goddess of love, and Jupiter is named after the Roman god of benevolence. The image that I would like to share with you of Venus comes from a book written by Christine de Pizan, who lived from 1364 to 1430. Here she depicts Venus and her children. Venus is in the top part of the picture, and you can see that she is seated in a sort of globe, a globe of blue around her, and on her lap are these beautiful, lovely hearts. And underneath, there are people who are reaching out to her with their hearts. Now, it's not really clear as to whether Venus is distributing hearts among them, and so they're reaching out to fetch or to get their heart, to receive their heart, or if they are actually offering up their hearts to Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, in hopes that Venus will make a wonderful match for them in terms of courtship and romance. I love this image of Venus enthroned, shall we say, in a beautiful orb of blue that comes to us from Christine de Pizan's book, The Epistle of Orthia to Hector, which was written between 1399 and 1400. Christine de Pizan, who lived from 1364 until 1430, was the daughter of an astrologer who was originally located in Venice, Italy, before he moved to France. The reason her father moved to France is because he had been hired by King Charles V of France to be his court astrologer and secretary. Christine de Pizan learned astrology from her father. She had access to his wonderful library and herself commissioned a book of astrology. And in this book are shown the different portraits of the planets and their children. What I love about this image is that Venus appears in a bubble, and that is indeed how Glinda appears at the beginning of the musical Wicked. She descends from the sky in a bubble, and people are celebrating Glinda. They're always happy to see Glinda, and she arrives to tell them the good news that indeed the Wicked Witch of the West is dead. This is what begins the musical Wicked. Like Venus, Glinda is young, she's beautiful, she's fair-skinned, and she's fair-haired. Everyone loves it when Glinda shows up. They're always full of joy and happiness. Even though they happen to be singing at the time, no one mourns the wicked die alone. Okay, so Glinda shows up at the beginning of Wicked with the news of the demise of the Wicked Witch of the West, singing "No one mourns the wicked die alone." And so within all of this celebration and frivolity, someone asks Glinda the inconvenient question of, well, didn't you know the Wicked Witch of the West? And that stops Glinda in her tracks. She's a little nervous answering that question, but she goes ahead and she answers that question. And in her answering of that question, we learn the story of Elphaba. The name Elphaba is taken from Frank L. Baum's initials. Gregory Maguire was playing around with them, and he liked the idea of working with L, F, and B. L, by the way, stood for Lyman. So he worked with the letters L, F, B, and came up with Elphaba. Elphaba came into this world as a love child. Elphaba's father was a very famous preacher in Munchkinland who was often away from home, preaching to heathens and trying to convert them to his religion, leaving his wife alone, very bored and very, very lonely, until she meets a traveling salesman who shows up one day, and they make love and they become lovers, and she has a child. One of the things in the traveling salesman's possession is a little bottle of green fluid called the elixir of something or other that he shares with Elphaba's mother, and she drinks. I think it's a little bit of hooch, or what passed for hooch back in Munchkinland back then. But in any case, he travels on and the mother gives birth. And what's fascinating in the novel is that the midwives who help to deliver Elphaba are a young maiden, a mother, and a crone who come together to help deliver Elphaba into the world. So you have there the three phases of the moon appearing with the birth of Elphaba. So the child is born green, which testifies to the fact that Elphaba is not her father's daughter, which, as you can imagine, is more than a little embarrassing, considering his career as a preacher and a man of faith. And also, Elphaba in the novel has really sharp teeth. They're so sharp that they draw blood. And so it is impossible for Elphaba's mother to nurse her. And this is Maguire's way of saying that Elphaba really never had a mother's love, that she is alone and on her own in the world. In the musical, we learn that Glinda, who was then called Galinda, we learn that Galinda and Elphaba first met at school at Shiz University, which is kind of like a Aussian version of Hogwarts. In any case, Galinda is like a society girl. She's very much a spoiled brat, and in the musical, she enters like atop a whole cart of luggage, and she's immediately popular, and everyone loves Galinda. And Elphaba is the strange green girl who shows up accompanied by her sister Nessa Rose, who was born with deformed legs and is wheelchair bound. Their father has taken them to this school, and their father says to Elphaba, I want you to look after your young sister, and Elphaba promises to do so. And in a parting gesture, her father then gives Nessa Rose a pair of ruby slippers to wear on her feet. Not that she can walk around in them or anything like that, but he just wants her to have something special. He favors Nessa Rose. Nessa Rose he regards as being his true child, and well, Elphaba is the illegitimate child. So while this is going on, there's a call out, a roll call of who's going to be rooming with whom. And Galinda says, I'll room with whomever, because she's popular and she expects that she's going to be roomed with whoever is the most other popular girl in the school. But at that moment, Elphaba's name is called out. So Galinda and Elphaba wind up rooming together. And Nessa Rose is then wheeled on out by an instructor named Madame Morrible to go and stay in a different dorm. Elphaba is not only shocked and furious that she's going to be rooming with Galinda, who's showing a similar expression of revulsion at the idea, but her sister is being wheeled away without her having really noticed it, and she calls out, and in that moment, the wheelchair stops. Madame Morrible tries pushing it forward, but the wheelchair stops. It circles around, it leaves Madame Morrible's hands, and it comes to Elphaba. And so it stops in its tracks right in front of Elphaba. And of course, Nessa Rose is upset. She's crying and she's saying, Elphaba, you promised not to do that. Again, you promised me. And Madame Morrible, who is the head instructor, is really quite impressed. And she is like, where did this come from? This feat of magic of yours? And Elphaba's like, well, it just sort of showed up, and give me back my sister. And Madame Morrible says, certainly, you could room with your sister as well, but I want to take sole charge of your magical training. And if you are successful with your magical training, my dear, perhaps one day, you could meet the Wizard of Oz. And Elphaba is absolutely impressed and carried away with this idea of meeting the Wizard of Oz in person. This excitement is almost immediately quelled upon the realization that she is still going to have to room with Galinda. And Galinda is not too pleased about it either. And the two of them grudgingly form a sort of icy truce. The next scene takes place in Dr. Dillamond's class. Dr. Dillamond is a goat and a professor of history. He also happens to be an animal rights activist. Now, in Oz, all animals can talk, like, for instance, the cowardly lion. But the wizard has convinced Ozians that talking animals are dangerous, that they should be beasts of burden, not equals, and that they should be deprived of their citizens' rights. This is a sentiment that's been sort of going around. And so as Dr. Dillamond teaches the class, some members of the class are sort of giggling among themselves and eyeing and pointing to him. At one point in the lesson, he turns over the blackboard, and on the other side of the blackboard is written, "Animals should be seen and not heard." And this causes the class to burst into uproarious laughter. There is a movement afoot to suppress animal rights, and Dr. Dillamond ultimately falls victim to it. But at this point, he is horrified and he is embarrassed, and the class leaves. And it is Elphaba who stays behind to console him. She asks him if he would like to share her lunch, and he says yes, and she takes out a sandwich, and Dr. Dillamond promptly takes the wrapping paper around the sandwich and pops it into his mouth. He's a goat, after all. But during their conversation, he begins to bleat like a goat. Just sort of, it comes out of nowhere, kind of like a hiccup. And Elphaba is taken aback by that, as is Dr. Dillamond. Like, what is causing this sort of bleeding to occur? This is something that distresses both Dr. Dillamond and Elphaba, and she swears to him that she will get to the bottom of it. So in this scene, she is put in opposition to both Madame Morrible and the school, people who are looking to demote Professor Dillamond. Now, I would like to take a quick moment here to share with you a favorite image of mine. It's an engraving done by Albrecht Dürer, and it portrays a witch. And this is the way that witches were seen in the 15th century. So what you see here is an old woman, naked, and she's riding on top of a goat. She's riding on top of this goat, and she's riding facing backwards. The association of the goat with witches was basically an association of witches being connected to Satan. What it comes from is the zodiac sign of Capricorn. So Capricorn, as we all know, is the zodiac sign of the goat. Capricorn is ruled by a planet. The planet that rules Capricorn is Saturn. And Saturn, which we know nowadays as being the planet of tests, trials, and tribulations, was also seen back in the day as a malevolent force, as a malicious force, as a planet that sought nothing else other than the doom and the gloom of people in the world. So there was a sort of satanic association with the planet Saturn. So with Saturn ruling the zodiac sign of Capricorn, which was the zodiac sign of the goat, and a witch riding astride it, but facing backwards, this is the connection that we begin to get between witchcraft and Satanism and Saturn and Capricorn. They're all sort of folded in together. Now, Saturn was famously the planet of old age. It was, as I mentioned before, a very dim light in the sky, very slow moving, very distant, like an old person. Now, if you remember from previous episodes, in Roman mythology, Saturn overthrows his father Uranus, only to in turn be overthrown by his own son, Jupiter. So when Jupiter overthrows Saturn, Saturn being a god, he couldn't kill him, he couldn't get rid of him. And the question was, well, what do you do with the old man? So Saturn was sent into exile on the planet Earth. It was Saturn who wandered from country to country, and it's Saturn in Roman mythology who teaches mankind, humankind, to farm the earth and to produce fruits and vegetables from the earth itself. So anything that is elderly, anything that is slow, anything that is malevolent, maybe you see where I'm going here, all of these aspects were going to be associated to children of Saturn, people born under the planet Saturn. And one of the children of Saturn were, of course, witches. So here you see a witch riding backwards. Okay, so everything is the inverse. It's backwards when you're dealing with Saturn. Saturn takes the longest time to orbit the sun. Of the traditional 7 planets in astrology, Saturn is retrograde the longest because it's so far away from the sun. So Saturn was seen as old, slow, and retrograde. Saturn was also seen as heavy. Saturn was associated to heavy moods like melancholy and gloom and depression. So what we also see in this engraving are the putti. Putti are the little Cupid-esque winged figures who are usually flying around and reclining on clouds and looking up at people and things like this. But in this particular engraving, these putti are earthbound. One of them carries an alchemist's cauldron that he's offering up to the witch. Another one carries herb that was popular in witchcraft in the day, which was applethorn. And then the other two are just on the ground and they can't possibly get up. Everything is heavy. There's a gravitational pull that holds them down. And so this is why everything connected with Saturn, including the people born under Saturn, are old and decrepit and slow, and they're full of ill will and they're malevolent and they just want bad things for other people because they're just miserable and jealous and dreadful people to know. Witchcraft was often associated with women. It wasn't exclusive to women. There were several men who were also lynched or burned at the stake as witches. But for the most part, witchcraft was associated with women. And usually these were elderly women. These were women who weren't desirable. These were women who weren't attractive. These were women who perhaps lived by themselves. Maybe they were widows. Maybe they had outlived their husbands. Basically, women who were kind of like keeping their own company. Well, a big reason why this particular class of women were targeted as witches was, for the most part, they were unmarried and they were older. They were living in a very male-dominated society in Europe. And people who coveted their land, maybe it was an in-law or a descendant, coveted the land that had been willed to a widow by her husband. And maybe this in-law or this relative wanted the house or they wanted the property. And oftentimes what they would do is that they would accuse the woman of witchcraft. And so the woman would be carted off to jail and she would be put into prison along with other women who maybe had fallen on hard times. They had become beggars, or maybe they were homeless, or maybe they just preferred their own company and didn't like to go and intermingle with the rest of the village. And so a lot of these women would be incarcerated. They would be put into prisons. And at certain times when maybe the prison was overfilling or the witchcraft craze happened to be heightened, they would be dragged on out and they would be lynched or they would be burned at the stake. And so it was society's way of getting rid of the refuse. It was society's way of getting rid of undesirable people, which were usually people who were older or who lived on the margins of society. And these happened to also be the children of Saturn. So after this incident at Professor Dillamond's class, Elphaba meets Fiyero, who is a superficial, winky prince. He's obviously a man of privilege, and he's been thrown out of one university after another. He's very beautiful. He's very handsome. He has a sort of like reckless quality. He's well moneyed financially. And of course, Glinda develops a crush on him immediately. The two of them decide to go out with one another because he's immediately going to be the most popular boy in school. She's the most popular girl. And Fiyero doesn't really know how long he's going to last at this particular university, and why not? And so what happens is that there is a ball, I guess it's a kind of prom that Shiz University is throwing. And now that that match has been made between Fiyero and Glinda, in true Venusian fashion, Glinda decides to match up Nessa Rose with Bach, a fellow Munchkiner, and they're all going to go to the ball. Glinda also takes note that Fiyero takes a sort of passing interest in Elphaba. They meet and they're squabbling right away, with Elphaba insulting Fiyero and Fiyero being very amused by all of these insults. And Glinda decides, this green girl could end up being a rival of hers. So she insists that Elphaba come to the ball as well, and Elphaba reluctantly agrees. And on the night of the ball, Glinda gives Elphaba a pointed black hat, a witch's hat, essentially, and says, this looks amazing on you, and you should wear this to the ball. And Elphaba, more out of wanting to chaperone her sister than anything else, agrees to go to the ball. At the ball, where everyone is dancing and romancing and having a wonderful time, Madame Marable presents Glinda with a wand, which is very surprising, Glinda wants to study sorcery, but Madame Morrible decided that Glinda was just too superficial and silly and decided against it. So Glinda asks Madame Morrible, why is she presenting her with a wand? And Madame Morrible answers, well, it's not really my gift. It's your roommate, Elphaba's. She insisted that you join the sorcery program. And I agreed only because Elphaba wouldn't continue studying with me unless you were part of this as well. And if you're going to be a part of this, here's a magic wand, and here it is. Personally, I have no faith in your talent whatsoever, but here you go. And so Glinda, in this moment, is so moved that Elphaba, her roommate, would have given her this gift. And of course, it's at that moment that Elphaba arrives at the ball in the pointed black witch's hat, and everyone laughs uproariously. This is a wonderful moment in the musical because what we see here happening is that the person who was supposed to be malevolent, the malefic planet, the Saturn figure, Elphaba, has actually done a good deed to the person who's supposed to be good. And it's the person who's supposed to be good who's done a wicked deed to the person who's supposed to be malevolent. And so this is a fascinating demonstration of that. What we also see is that it is Glinda who outfits Elphaba with the witch's hat. So in essence, what's being demonstrated here is projection, that Glinda sees Elphaba as the witch, as the one to be scorned. She gives her the witch's hat, which came from Glinda's hat collection, by the way. And where Elphaba's complexion is green, which is the color of envy and jealousy, it's actually the Benefic. It's Glinda as the Venus who has projected her jealousy and her envy onto Elphaba. And as I said, Elphaba shows Glinda nothing but a good turn. She insists that Glinda join the sorcery course. Glinda would never have joined if it weren't for Elphaba, but what Glinda gave Elphaba in that trade was an object of derision, something that makes Elphaba a target of ridicule and hostility. What happens next? Elphaba, being long accustomed to people ridiculing her, making fun of her, and being the target of hostility, what she does, standing there alone in the middle of the ball, is basically she does what we would call the Elphaba dance. She just starts dancing by herself. And of course, this makes people even more, amused with this. But she's just doing her own sort of Elphaba thing, which is very Saturnian, which is, okay, I'm going to be the object of ridicule. Well, I'm not going to leave. I'm going to stand my ground defiantly and just be here, just do my own thing. And Glinda, seeing this, feeling really bad about how she had set Elphaba up for this humiliation, Glinda goes and she starts to dance with Elphaba. She also does an Elphaba dance, but a Glinda version of the Elphaba dance. And they create this bubble in the middle of the ballroom. They create this bubble of friendship, where they dance with one another and they recognize one another. They recognize something about one another that they like. They're not really quite sure of what that is. And everyone else sort of ends up sort of doing the dance that they're doing. And it's a real marvelous moment in the musical, the way that this friendship sort of really comes out of what was such a setup for rivalry and for malice. Now, Elphaba hasn't really won anyone over, but what she has done is that she's earned everyone's respect. Later on that evening, we return to Elphaba and Glinda's dorm room, and they're having girl talk. They're exchanging secrets. Glinda confides in Elphaba that she's going to marry Fiero, and Elphaba's like, well, that was quick. And does he know about that? And she's like, he doesn't need to know about it. It's a match made in heaven. And so Elphaba's like, okay. And Glinda's like, well, I want you to tell me a secret. And Elphaba confides in Glinda about how she blames herself for her sister's disfigurement, Her mother didn't want another green child, and so her mother ate milk flowers. Milk flowers had been prescribed to her, and her mother ate milk flowers while she was pregnant with Nessa Rose. And so Nessa Rose was born too soon. Her legs weren't fully formed, and her mother also died as a result of Nessa Rose's childbirth. And so this is why Elphaba has always blamed herself for Nessa Rose being in the condition that she's in, and she's been the sort of hovering and protective presence in Nessa Rose's life. And again, we see the Saturn aspects of shame and guilt coming out in Elphaba's character. And this brings about a response from Glinda. Glinda shares one of my favorite lines, actually, in the script. And what Glinda says to Elphaba is, well, that may be your secret, Elphaba, but it doesn't make it true. And I love that line. I think that that's such an amazing line. That may be your secret, but it doesn't make it true. And it's something that I think we should all think of when we're in moments of shame, or when we're in moments of guilt, or when we're in moments of remorse, which can be usually built around a secret shame or a secret pain. But just because it's a secret doesn't mean that it's true. Then, of course, Glinda launches into her song Popular, which is a wonderful song. It happens to be a favorite song of my producer, Joe G, who told me about this wonderful remix that was made in 2013 that was sung by the Lebanese singer Mika and Ariana Grande. It borrowed from the well-known melody at the time, Popular, from the musical Wicked, that Ariana Grande participated in this music video that was based on Popular, only to go on to play the role of Glinda in the film itself. And of course, in the music video, she and Mika play kind of Saturn children. They play witches, people who've been cast out by popular society and who are going to take their revenge by turning the popular people into statues and smashing them. Anyway, it's kind of a funny twist here that she sang the song and now she's singing the song again in the musical. And I don't know, it just makes me giggle, and I think it's all kinds of fun. After this, we are back at the lecture hall on the following day, where Elphaba is wearing a flower that Fiyero notices, and he's like, oh, I see that you've been Galindified. And Elphaba's like, huh? And he's like, that's a sign of Glinda. You would never wear a flower like that on your own, and you don't have to do that. Just be your own person. And Elphaba's kind of like annoyed, but at the same time flattered that he noticed her like this. In this scene, we see Dr. Dillamond relieved of his professorial duties. He's been fired by the university. He's actually escorted out by the secret Oz police, and he is replaced by another professor who is experimenting on a caged animal. And he's trying to test the fear factor of this lion cub. And the lion cub cries out. And the whole class is really sort of shocked at this, not only with the removal of their professor, but now that they're seeing a captive animal tortured in service to a scientific experiment. And the other students don't really know what to do, but Elphaba, sort of like lashes out in her fury, and she makes the students and the professor do the Elphaba dance or start moving around quirkily. She grabs the cage of the lion cub, who is shrieking in fear, and she rushes out of the lecture hall, and Fiyero follows closely behind. The two of them are surprised to see each other with each other at this point, and Elphaba has her mission, which is to release this frightened lion, which of course grows up to become the cowardly lion, and she does. And, Fiyero's like, what did you do to those people back there? All these crazy things happen whenever you're around. And Elphaba answers in true Saturnian fashion, I don't cause commotions, I am one. And Fiyero, expressing his concern, makes Elphaba wonder if there might not be something more to Fiyero, whether there might not be some depth to his personality. And Fiyero answers, excuse me, there's no pretense here. I happen to be self-absorbed and deeply shallow. And so they sort of mark their places in the sand, that she's a commotion and he's going to be deeply shallow, but there's still this chemistry between the two of them, a chemistry that will bring them together as lovers later on. Madame Morrible appears with news that the wizard wants to see Elphaba, and Elphaba is all kinds of excited, not only because she's been fangirling about the Wizard of Oz all along, but because she can also take the case of the animals to the Wizard of Oz. She can plead with the Wizard of Oz that Professor Dillamond be restored to his professorship and that the Wizard of Oz take a strong stand with protecting animals' rights. Elphaba is under the impression that the Wizard of Oz doesn't know that there is persecution of animals that's going on throughout all of Oz. And so she goes to a train station, and Nessa Rose is seeing her sister off, and Fiyero shows up to sort of say goodbye. And Glinda sees that Fiyero is really paying a lot of attention to Elphaba, and she's starting to become a little bit jealous about that. And so Glinda sort of announces in that moment that in honor of Elphaba going off to Oz, that she's going to show solidarity with the animals and change her name from Glinda to Glinda. And everyone's kind of like, oh, okay, but Glinda will do anything to be the center of attention. And so that doesn't really go over. It kind of goes over like a lead balloon. But Elphaba, good humored by the whole thing, says, Glinda, why don't you come to the Emerald City with me? And she's like, it's not Glinda, it's Glinda. And she's like, okay, Glinda, let's both go and see the wonderful Wizard of Oz. And so they do. So when they get to the Emerald City, it's a bit funny because Glinda had always been the center of attention at the university, and Elphaba was the standout because of her green skin. In the Emerald City, everything is green. Everything is so green and emerald that you wear these special glasses in order to see things. So here in the Emerald City, Elphaba fits right in. She's as green as the city is itself. And so the two of them are immediately given audience with the wizard. And the wizard comes and appears on stage, not as a man, but as that huge head that we are all familiar with from the 1939 film. And so there's a sort of robotic version of it in the musical. And he roars his greeting to them and asks them why they're there. And they're both sort of cowering at first. And then all of a sudden, the wizard is like, is that you, Elphaba? And Elphaba's like, yeah, it is. And so the head, lowers down to the stage, and the wizard comes out from behind it, and he introduces himself to Elphaba. And Elphaba is a bit shocked and amazed that the contraption wasn't the wizard, that there was actually someone behind operating it, and that this person knew her name and seems really quite delighted and excited about meeting her. Glinda introduces herself to the wizard, and the wizard says, and your name is? And she says, Glinda. The G is silent, and the wizard is just delighted. He's a very jovial man, a very jovial presence. And he says, that's what I love best, making people happy. That's something that makes me really, really thrilled. And he turns to Elphaba and he says, I want to help you with your ascent. And Elphaba's like, my ascent? And he's like, yes, I want to help you with your ascent. I've heard a lot about you from Madame Morrible. And Elphaba's like, Madame Morrible? And he's like, oh, we're old friends. We go back ages. And Elphaba's like, oh, how wonderful. And Elphaba immediately begins to tell the wizard that the animals of Oz are in trouble, that there's this movement to silence them and to degrade them. And is there anything that he could do to help her? And the wizard said, of course, I can do something to help you. I mean, it's my job as the Wizard of Oz to grant wishes to people. But you need to help me out first. And Elphaba's like, certainly, I'll help you with anything. I mean, I don't know what I could do that could possibly help you, a great and magnificent wizard. But if you need my help, just say whatever it is. And the wizard says, what I want you to do is to read this book. And he snaps his fingers, and Madame Morrible appears carrying a large and ancient book. And the girls are very happy to see their teacher, and she's very happy to see the girls. And this is a wonderful reunion. And so Elphaba looks at the book and looks at the wizard, and she says, well, what do you want me to do? And the wizard says, I want you to do a little bit of magic from this book. And Elphaba's like, I guess I don't really know, but I'll give it my best shot. And so the wizard asks for his monkey servant, Chistery, to be brought in. And so Chistery comes scrambling on in. And the wizard turns to Elphaba and he says, "This is Chistery. And every morning I see Chistery looking out the window longingly at these birds who fly and gather amongst the trees. And I get the sense that Chistery wants to be free like that Chistery wants to fly like a bird like that. And I'm wondering if you could help Chistery to realize his fondest dream." And Elphaba is like, "I'm flattered that you think that I could do such a thing, but I don't know how." And the wizard says, "I want you to open this book. I want you to look within the pages of this grimoire. And I want you to read this spell of levitation. And let's see what happens when you read it." And so Elphaba's like, "I mean, I can barely read it. I mean, it's written in hieroglyphs." And the wizard's like, and she's like, "I'll give it my best shot." And all of a sudden, Elphaba, as she begins to focus on the book, she almost sings out the sounds of the book. There's an immediate fluency. There's immediate bond between her and this book. And she sings out this spell. And as she sings out this spell, Chistery begins to sprout wings from the back. And he is both excited, the monkey is both excited by what's going on, but at the same time, it howls and it screams out in pain. And Elphaba is immediately shocked and she turns to the wizard and she's like, what have I done? What have I done? Help me to stop the spell. Help me to reverse the spell. Chistery is in pain. And at that moment, there is a chorus of howls that sing out. There is a chorus of howls that join Chistery in his howling, and curtains part to reveal caged monkeys, like lab monkeys, all howling and screaming and clawing at the cages. And Elphaba is horrified by this, and they all begin springing wings from their back. And these wings are leathery, and they begin to sort of flap like this. And Elphaba is like, help me to stop, wizard, help me to put an end to their pain, to their misery." And the wizard is delighted. There's the biggest expression of joy and delight. And he says, "Elphaba, you've done it. You've done it, my child. You've turned these monkeys into flying monkeys. Look at what you've done. It's beyond what I ever hoped that you could do." And Elphaba is like, "But they're in pain." And the wizard says, "The pain is passing. Don't you see that I can use these monkeys as spies and that they can report on subversive animal activity throughout all of Oz? I don't have to rely on soldiers anymore. I can send out these flying monkeys and they will be my eyes and they will be my ears." And Elphaba realizes that she has been set up, that she has been used, and she confronts the wizard. She says, "How could you possibly do this? Why would you want to do such a thing?" And the wizard answers her, "When I first got here, Oz was full of discord and discontent. And where I come from, everyone knows that the best way to bring folks together is to give them a really good enemy." And so Elphaba answers, "And that enemy is supposed to be the animals, right?" And the wizard nods and says, "Yes." And Elphaba says, because the realization has just dawned, you can't read this book at all. That's why you need an enemy and spies and cages. You need people to do the work for you. You used me. You needed me. You had no real power." And the wizard says, "Exactly. And that's why I need you." And Elphaba refuses to cooperate. Elphaba refuses to have anything to do with him. And she runs away from the wizard. And she's followed by Glinda. And they rush up the stairs and they leave the wizard's throne room and they rush up the stairs to the attic. Now, what begins resounding through all the halls of the wizard's palace is there is an evil power afoot. She's recognized immediately. She's wearing a black gown and a conical hat, and she has green skin. And so I want you to get her. She's wicked. She's wicked. And you are to get her and you are to bring her back to me immediately. And so all the guards of the wizard's palace immediately go looking for Elphaba and Glinda. And so Glinda and Elphaba hide up in an attic, and it's there that Elphaba has carried the grimoire. She has the book with her still, and she opens up the book, and she's like, there's got to be something that will get us out of here. And Glinda's like, no, we have to turn ourselves in. Maybe if we show the wizard that we mean no harm, that he'll take mercy on us, and he'll like you again, Elphaba. And Elphaba's like, no, I want nothing to do with that man. What we need here is a levitation spell. And Glinda's like, no, you can't do that. That's what caused you all the trouble in the first place. I mean, what, you're going to recite the spell and sprout wings? Ew, gross. Don't do that to yourself. And Elphaba's like, here's the spell. Here's the spell. And she recites the spell. And nothing happens. And there's furious pounding at the door of the attic because the guards want to come in and seize them. And Glinda's like, give yourself up, give yourself up. And Elphaba's like, no. And she looks over at the door, and suddenly from the door, a broom lifts and it moves across the room. And the broom comes to Elphaba, and Elphaba grasps the broom and she holds it there. And she holds the broom, which is still floating in the air. It's still levitated. Glinda pleads with Elphaba to give herself up to the guards and to come back to the wizard and that everything will be fine. And Elphaba responds, no, I can't do it. I can't possibly do it. And Glinda's like, don't walk out on everything you've wanted. Don't walk out on everything you've worked so hard for. Elphaba says, but I don't want it. And she begins to sing, no, I can't want it anymore. Then she begins to sing this song from Wicked. It's the most famous song from the musical, and it's called Defying Gravity. Now, I'm not going to sing it to you, but what I wanted to do was to recite the words. She sings, something has changed within me. Something is not the same. I'm through with playing by the rules of someone else's game. Too late for second guessing. Too late to go back to sleep. It's time to trust my instincts, close my eyes, and leap. It's time to try defying gravity. I think I'll try defying gravity, and you can't pull me down. Glinda sings to her, can't I make you understand you're having delusions of grandeur? And Elphaba responds, I'm through accepting limits, because someone says they're so. Some things I cannot change, but till I try, I'll never know. Too long I've been afraid of losing love I guess I've lost. Well, if that's life, it comes at just too high a cost. I'd sooner buy defying gravity. Kiss me goodbye. I'm defying gravity. And you can't pull me down. And it's at that moment that the guards burst through the door, and Glinda takes a cloak. She says to Elphaba, Elfie, you're shivering, you're cold. And she takes this cloak, it's a black cloak, and she wraps it around Elphaba's shoulders. And so again here, Glinda dresses Elphaba up in the witch's attire. She's been adding each element to Elphaba's look as a witch, and she throws the cloak around her, and it's in that moment that the guards burst forth, and Elphaba begins to levitate. She begins to move up into the sky, holding on to this broom, and Glinda cries after her, Elfie, Elfie! And Elfie is rising higher and higher in the sky. And Elphaba says, it's me that you want. And the guards look on astonished and frightened at what is rising up through the air, holding on to this broomstick with this pointed cap and this marvelous black cape descending from around her shoulders. And she sings, it's me, it's me. So if you care to find me, look to the western sky, as someone told me lately, Everyone deserves the chance to fly. And if I'm flying solo, at least I'm flying free. To those who'd ground me, take a message back from me. Tell them how I am defying gravity. I'm flying high, defying gravity. And soon I'll match them in renown, and nobody in all of Oz, no wizard that there is or was, is ever going to bring me down. It's this amazing, triumphant moment that ends Act One as Elphaba steps into the mantle of becoming the Wicked Witch of the West, as she soars up into the sky. And what's so amazing about this is that you see her. What is she singing? She's singing Defying Gravity. We saw those images before of the earthbound angels, of the heavy slowness of Saturn. But out of that comes a defiance. And Saturn is the planet of defiance. It's not the way that we're used to thinking of Saturn. We're used to thinking of Saturn as being decrepit, as being those people who are tossed out, those people who live on the margins. If you look at the world of Jupiter, and there is an engraving which is called the Children of Jupiter. And if you look at this engraving, you see driving this chariot. The chariot is driven by peacocks, which of course are sacred to his wife Juno. And in front of Jupiter is this person asking favor. He's holding up a bowl of gold shekels, and he's asking for Jupiter to bestow upon him a blessing. He's asking for Jupiter to grant a wish. And the children of Jupiter, who are pictured beneath this Jove driving in his chariot, what we see are the Pope in his papal court, surrounded by riches, surrounded by people who are genuflecting. And in the background, you see the emperor, because at the time of this engraving, which is in the 16th century, the Holy Roman Empire belonged to both the Holy Roman Emperor, the emperor himself, and the Pope. And they divided their duty, their reignship over the empire. And so Jupiter is associated with benevolence. It's associated with everything that's good and with blessings. And it is the ultimate court of power. It is the halls of justice. Jupiter is associated to wisdom. Jupiter is associated to the Wizard of Oz, the great and mighty and all-powerful Oz, that if we believe in him and if we do what we're told, only good things will happen. Everything will be blessed. On the opposite side of this, and what I want to show you in the other image, is the children of Saturn. And you can see the contrast right away. Saturn carries a scythe, his chariot is pulled by dragons, and there are children that he is swallowing. Okay, he's actually actively swallowing a child as we speak. And below Saturn are his children, people born into misery, the hard workers, the laborers, the people who work the farms, who curate crops that may spoil if they don't get enough rain. Saturn rules over people who are given the unenviable jobs like tanning and skinning. Saturn rules over those who are put in prison. Saturn rules over people of the Jewish faith, which you can see when you see this close-up of a man. He's wearing the yellow circle stitched on his tunic. And this was a sign in medieval times that he was of the Jewish faith. And so he was an outsider. He was outside the Catholic Church. He lived on the margins. You see him talking to a man held in stocks. This might be a prisoner. This might be a blasphemer. This might be someone who's also a marginalized member of society. So where Jupiter rules over the grandeur of society, Saturn ruled over the lowest of society, people of the lowest rank. When we look down to the lower right-hand corner, we see the elderly here. But the elderly are being taken care of by monks who have taken the vow of poverty. So they're not like the Pope surrounded by his cardinals in this ornate palace of the Vatican. These monks have taken vows of poverty, and so they're practicing true charity. They're helping those that society has thrown out or ignored or deemed unworthy, and that they're sharing this sort of Christian charity. And this is also an aspect of Saturn because it's the people who have suffered ridicule. It's the people who have been made fun of. It's the people who have been targeted with hostility and with hatred and with venom. These are the people who actually understand charity. It's the people of want who understand charity and generosity much more than people of power and people of grandeur. And these, of course, are Elphaba's people. I hope you're enjoying this week's episode of Christopher Renstrom Astrology. If you like the channel, please go to rulingplanets.com and subscribe for my daily horoscopes, weekly horoscopes, cosmic alerts, and more. Act 2 of Wicked moves very, very quickly. This is where people's true faces are revealed. Elphaba is on the lam. She is deemed a terrorist in Oz, and everyone is out to find her and to destroy her. She's called Wicked. She's not even called really the Wicked Witch of the West or Elphaba. She's just called Wicked. That's the name that she goes by, or that's the name that they give her, and all of the land is looking for her. Fiero has become a captain of the Wizard's Guard, and he's also hunting for her. And Glinda has risen in status. She is celebrated as a sorceress, a good sorceress, in contrast to Elphaba being a wicked or an evil sorceress. So Glinda is given a bubble that she moves around in, and she's moving in higher society, and she is seen as being the voice of the wizard. She tells the people good things and that they are looking for this wicked witch, and she's very reassuring of the populace, and they all love her because Glinda makes them all feel better. Elphaba goes to her sister Nessa Rose in Munchkinland because that's their home. That's where they come from. Elphaba and Nessa Rose are both from Munchkinland, and she goes to her sister, who has become governor of Munchkinland. Elphaba, being the oldest daughter, would have taken on that role, but she is now a felon, a fugitive of justice who's on the run. And she goes to Nessa Rose for some kind of shelter, and Nessa Rose refuses to give it to her. She says, listen, I'm a governor right now. I have responsibilities. Actually, what I should do is turn you in. And Elphaba is absolutely shocked that this is what her sister would say. And her sister was like, you left me. You left me to become a fugitive. And now you run around Oz and you're doing animal rescues and things like that, while I'm in this chair and I can't help myself, and you could have practiced magic and you could have healed me. And Elphaba's like, I don't know if I can do that kind of magic. I mean, I don't even really know how this works. And Nessa Rose is like, I hate you. I hate you. So Elphaba just sort of mutters some words over the ruby slippers, and immediately the legs pull up and out and away from the wheelchair. And Nessa Rose is like, what's going on? Make it stop. And Elphaba's like, I don't know. And the shoes come to life, and they allow Nessa Rose to walk and to stand. And Nessa Rose is healed. But instead of becoming good, she's actually been very sour and very bitter this whole time. And she becomes a very spiteful and a very dark and a very vengeful personality. She becomes what will later be called the Wicked Witch of the East. After being rejected by her sister, Elphaba goes to the wizard's chambers to free the flying monkeys, who are being used as spies and to help force Ozians to do the wizard's bidding. I mean, they're kind of like secret police on wings. And so the wizard has been waiting for Elphaba, and he confronts her, and Elphaba points her broom at him. He confronts her and offers her an olive branch to join forces. He says, it must be very lonely being on the run. This doesn't have to be the way that it is. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot, and we can find something that will serve both of our interests. I know that you're very caring of these monkeys, and so maybe we can start with that in terms of fashioning our compromise. The wizard tells her how he comes from another land, another country outside of Oz altogether, and that he was in a balloon that was blown to Oz, and that when the balloon descended, people believed that he was a man of wonders. And he thought to himself, well, why not? If that's what they want to pin on me, I'll just, walk the walk and talk the talk until I can sort of see what to do with this. And what he got in exchange was fame and a palace and everyone doing his bidding. And Elphaba says to him, "But you lied to them." And the wizard responds, "Only verbally. Besides, where I'm from, we believe all sorts of things that aren't true. We call it history." Elphaba, exhausted by being on the run, agrees to join forces with the wizard if he will set the monkeys free. And so the Wizard of Oz agrees. He will set the monkeys free. And the monkeys are elated. They're free to fly high in the sky and to live their own lives. And Elphaba is happy for them until she sees that there is a blanket that's moving and that there's a figure underneath this blanket that's slowly rising up to its feet. And Elphaba is like, "What's this?" And she reaches to the blanket and she throws the blanket off and she sees Dr. Dillamond. And she is like, "Dr. Dillamond, it's Elphaba. Do you recognize me?" I mean, she looks a bit different with the hat and the cape and everything. She's like, "But it's me. It's Elphaba, your student." And she tries to embrace Dr. Dillamond, but he only bleats in her face. And she realizes that he's been reduced to a speechless goat, a goat on all fours, a goat that has no capacity to speak or think in the way that Dr. Dillamond once thought, a goat with no memory. It just looks at her empty-eyed, bleeding. And so the guards rush in to stop Elphaba. And, at that moment, Fiyero stops the guards. He's the head of the guards. Glinda arrives. And in that moment, Fiyero helps Elphaba to escape. And Glinda, who thought that Fiyero was going to be her fiancé, is completely brokenhearted by this revelation that he has always loved her. Madame Morrible arrives, and both she and the wizard console Glinda, who's clearly heartbroken, and they ask her if she could think of any way that they could trap Elphaba. And Glinda says, "Well, all you have to do is start a rumor that her sister Nessa Rose is in danger, and Elphaba will fly to her rescue. That I can assure you." And Morrible and the wizard look at one another like, "Nah, a rumor's not going to get her to go. She's going to see right through that rumor. That won't work." And so Glinda's like, "Well, that's all I have to advise you." And so she leaves. But Madame Morrible is like, "I can think of something." And the wizard's like, "What?" Madame Morrible her expertise in magic is weather. And so it's Madame Morrible, being a weather witch, who cryptically declares that she can cause a change in the weather. We then move to a scene where Elphaba and Fiyero are reunited. They're lovers. They're so happy to be in one another's arms again. And Fiyero says, "What I want you to do is I want you to go to my castle, Kianakol, and use that as a hideout. And there you can rest and restore and get yourself back in shape again because, honey, you look really tired. You look like you could really use some food and some sleep." And Elphaba says, "Okay, yes, I'll go ahead and do that." And so she leaves to do that. And at that point, Fiyero looks over on the horizon and he's like, "Is that like a cyclone or tornado heading this way?" And of course it is. And so Madame Morrible has caused this cyclone to happen. And as we all know, the cyclone is carrying the house that Dorothy is in, and that house lands in Munchkinland, and it lands on top of Nessa Rose, who is crushed immediately beneath the house. And you see only the ruby slippers. Glinda, of course, appears and she pacifies the Munchkins. She is an agent of the wizard, and she gives the ruby slippers to Dorothy, and she sends Dorothy on the yellow brick road to the Wizard of Oz in the Emerald City because only he could fulfill her wish of helping her to find her way home again. Well, Elphaba shows up and she confronts Glinda. She's like, how could you betray me? How could you give my sister's ruby slippers to that girl that killed her? How could you possibly do that?" And so they have this very shrill and wild argument. And Elphaba says to Glinda, "You call this an accident?" And Glinda responds, "How about if we call it a regime change caused by a bizarre and unexpected twister of fate?" And Elphaba says, so you think cyclones just appear out of the blue? And Glinda's like, I don't know. And Elphaba, of course you don't know. And of course not. You're too busy telling people how wonderful life is. And Glinda responds, well, I'm a public figure now. People expect me to be upbeat. People expect me to, Elphaba, lie. Glinda, be encouraging. And what exactly have you been doing, Elfie, besides flying around on that filthy broom of yours? And Elphaba responds, well, we can't all come and go by bubble. And so immediately the two, descend on one another. There's this horrible cat fight that takes place. And Fiyero comes to Elphaba's rescue. And in doing that, he's seized upon guards who have been lying in wait, and he's taken off to prison. And Elphaba escapes, and Glinda is left alone, realizing that Fiyero and Elphaba are completely devoted to one another and that there's nothing that she can say or do about it. Elphaba has sided with resistance. She has started her own resistance to the wizard. And Glinda has sided with the wizard, who's given her everything she's ever wanted, and she's paying the price for that. Elphaba returns to the castle and, as we know from the story, imprisons Dorothy. And Dorothy is crying and just wants to go home. And Elphaba just can't stand it anymore. The child just keeps crying. And she's like, you can go home as soon as you take off those shoes. And Dorothy keeps saying, I can't take these shoes off. I can't take them off. Whatever I do, I can't pry them off. And Elphaba has even tried to help pry the shoes off as well, and they won't come off. And Elphaba's just so disgusted and annoyed with the girl. But at the same time, she's decided to surrender. And she's decided that there's only one way out. And so Glinda arrives at the palace, and she says to Glinda, there's only one way out. And Glinda is, what is it? And Elphaba is, my demise. And Glinda's like, no. I mean, we've had our differences. We've railed at one another and things like this, but you're still my friend. You're still my only friend. And I'm not going to give that up. And Elphaba says, listen, Glinda, I need you to listen to me. I'm going to die. And Glinda's like, you don't have to. And she said, I'm going to die. And when word gets out that I die, I want you to not clear my name. But Elfie, you're innocent of all these things that people accuse you. The wizard has done horrible things, and I'm ready to turn on him. And she said, no, what I need you to do is be on his side. Don't clear my name. And here, I need you to take care of the grimoire. And Glinda's like, the book? She's like, you need to take care of this book. You need to keep this book safe. The wizard wants this book, but only you can stand between the wizard and this book. You are to keep it safe. And Glinda's like, but I can't read it. I don't know what it means. You can read it. You cast these extraordinary spells. And Elphaba responds, then maybe it's time. Maybe it's time you took responsibility for being the sorceress that you are. Maybe it's time that you educated yourself, that you could read this book. Maybe it's time to step into the mantle of responsibility that you wear. And Glinda's like, I don't know if I can do that. And Elphaba says, I know you can. I know you can do it. But you have to push yourself, Glinda. You have to challenge yourself to do that. And then Elphaba departs. She enters into the scene where she threatens the scarecrow with fire. Dorothy throws water, and she melts and dissolves and is declared dead. What Glinda does while this is going on is that she retrieves Elphaba's hat, and she retrieves the green bottle of elixir, the green bottle of elixir that Elphaba has always carried with her. After Dorothy presents the wizard with the broom, and the wizard gives them certificates of here's a brain and there's a heart, and you've always had your courage, and Dorothy clicks her heels 3 times and goes back to Kansas. After all of that, Glinda appears to the wizard and to Madame Morrible. The first thing that she does is that she shows the wizard the little bottle of green elixir that Elphaba always carried with her in her pocket. And she says, do you recognize this? And the wizard recognizes it immediately. And Glinda says, I know that you recognized it because when I was despairing, you offered me a sip of this green elixir that you had in your pocket. And it matches the same vial of green elixir that was in Elphaba's pocket. And this is when we discover that the wizard was actually Elfie's father. So Glinda in this moment tells the wizard, what you're going to do is that you're going to leave Oz. You're going to get on that balloon of yours and you're going to hightail it out of here. Your days as the Wizard of Oz are over. And then she turns to Madame Morrible and she says, I wonder how you'll do in prison. You've thrown so many other people into prison. I wonder what a stay in prison will do for you, whether you'll enjoy yourself or not. And she's like, no, no, we can be friends. You were always my favorite student of sorcery. You were the one who is gifted, not that horrible Elphaba. And so Glinda like snaps her fingers and the guards appear and they take Morrible off to prison. And the wizard makes preparations to fly away in his balloon and leave. And so what we have happen here is that Glinda takes over Oz. She becomes the new reigning queen of Oz. In that moment where she ascends into her bubble and sort of hovers there in mid-space, we see Fiyero appear as the Scarecrow. He had been transformed by Elphaba's magic into a scarecrow. When he was taken away by the guards and it looked like he was going to be beaten to death, Elphaba had cast a spell. She didn't quite know what she was casting, a spell of transformation, and he had transformed into the scarecrow. So they're reunited. Bedroom problems. He's made of straw now, and she's, well, still Elphaba. But, they sing a reprise to a song where they see one another with different eyes now, both metaphorically and literally. So they escape, Fiyero and Elphaba, and they know that they will be free because Glinda will never know that Elphaba survived, that this is a ruse that they had orchestrated that would allow them to escape and to live together happily ever after. So the two of them escape to go live their lives, while Glinda leads the crowd in a chant of, no one mourns the wicked die alone. Now, what's so wonderful about this ending is that Elphaba and Glinda have changed places. The last thing Elphaba ever thought she would be living in her life would be a life of love. She had been an object of derision, a target of hostility. She had been ostracized by people, and she never thought that she would have a lover, much less a companion. And this is what she finds at the end of the musical. What Glinda finds at the end of the musical is that status that she always longed for. It didn't turn out the way that she had hoped or wished. She thought that it would include a husband and that she probably would have been a consort to a king, but instead, she's the ruler of Oz. She's kind of upgraded from Venus to Jupiter. So this exchange of roles where the child of Saturn is experiencing love and grace and happiness and acceptance, and where the child of Venus is now the Jupiter, she's now ruling with the wisdom that has been accrued from hard-won experience, from a broken heart, from sacrifices, from being used as a pawn, and realizing that she was playing into being used as a pawn, and deciding not to be used as a pawn anymore, that she really is going to be a figure of good. This is an astonishing and a wonderful alchemical transformation that takes place. Now, the thing about astrology is that the planets will always stay the planets. Jupiter will always be a benefic. It will always be associated with prosperity, good fortune, higher purpose, and fame. Saturn will always be a malefic. That is a planet associated to shortage, to coldness, to loss, to melancholy, to gloom. But at the same time, a planet that teaches people how to live in this world of perishables, how to live in a world where things don't always go well, that facing the reality that our wishes aren't always fulfilled, that our hearts do get broken, that not all of us get to go home again. Facing those things, Saturn outfits us for how to live in this world. And it really brings out the humanness in our humanity. And like I said, the planets will always be the planets. They're removed by all of this. The Earth is not their world. They are worlds unto themselves, but it is we. We are the ones who are changed by the planets and their transits. This is how Glinda becomes wise. This is how Elphaba is given a chance at love. This is what the planetary transits are all about. They don't simply reside in the constellations that we are born under and stamp us with a fate or destiny that is described by them. We live, we grow, we learn, we love because of the influence that the planets have on our lives. This is how each of us defies gravity. If you enjoyed what you saw, please press the like button. It helps more than you know. If you could subscribe, that would be wonderful. I've had such a wonderful time visiting with you this week, and I can't wait to get together next time on Christopher Renstrom Astrology.